Well, good morning, everybody. We are delighted again to be with you up here. This is a lovely part of the world. And listen, I've brought some rain and lovely sunshine today. So you better invite me again. Has there been enough rain? Farmers are never satisfied, I know. Not enough rain. I can see the head shaking. But at least it's better than nothing, isn't it? Yes. And I'll tell you what, I bring greetings from Bev, Bev Buchanan. We've become very great friends of Bev's. As you know, she's been out of the church for quite a long time, and it's been a real blessing to have her associated with the church. She's coming back with a very strong desire. I've talked to her about perhaps the possibility of her becoming a Bible worker, because as you know, you all know Bev. She's got a lovely personality, and she's got a real burden and a passion for spreading the message. And I know some of you are very good friends of hers here. She just sent up a picture this morning of some of you. 3 other girls that I can see here. So I just wanted to bring her greetings. Not only is Bev interested now, but also her husband, Andrew. Do you know Andrew? Yes, Andrew. And he's a very nice man too. And her daughter, Elise, and her son. Elise has been to some of the meetings. Cameron, is it? Cameron, yes. Yeah, Cameron. So I just wanted to bring you greetings from Bev. She's thinking of you this morning and sending us pictures, and we've sent back a picture of the church here this morning in Sabbath school. So that's wonderful. All right, this morning I want to talk to you about the year that changed the modern world. What year do you think that is? Well, some people tell me it was 1989, and the reason they give for 1989 is because that was the year of Tiananmen Square. Do you remember that? In which the Chinese troops killed over, at the instruction of the communistic leadership, killed or thousands and thousands of Chinese young people, shot them. And I've talked to quite a lot of Chinese young people. We used to operate a homestay when we were in Sydney, and we had a lot of Chinese. And I've talked to them all. They know nothing about Tiananmen Square. Complete silence in China about it. And which, as we would say, it's typical of communism. But even though that was a very significant event in 1989, that is not the year that changed the modern world. Also, 1989 is the year of solidarity in Poland, and that was when communism was defeated, first of all in Poland, and then it spread to all the other communistic states in Europe, and they left being communists. The only state that stood out against it was Romania. And you may remember the leader there, the Stalinist regime, and its leader, Ceausescu, was executed on December 25, 1989. He was a brutal individual, and they killed him in 1989. 1989 is when the Berlin Wall fell. So, as you can see, 1989 is a very significant year. 1989 is when John Paul II believed that it was the Virgin Mary that gained the victory over communism. And so 1989 is a very, very significant year, but it's not the year that changed the modern world. Well, people say to me, well, what about 2001, the towers? And that was significant, but life before the Twin Towers and life after the Twin Towers was not a lot different. So the Twin Towers, significant as it was, hasn't changed the modern world. I'm going to suggest a date this morning that has changed the modern world completely. And then I'm going to give you the evidence for it as we journey through the sermon this morning. The year that changed the modern world is 1844. And as I said, I'm going to give you the evidence for that as we go through. It's a deeply, deeply significant year. Now, let's go over to Daniel chapter 8, and I'll read you the background to this statement. But we won't be staying in Daniel 8 all the time, not at all. But this is Daniel chapter 8 and verse 12. Daniel 8 and verse 12. And I'm sure most of us know these verses well. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 12, it says this. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Now you imagine that this power was going to tread down the truth of God, and God is going to say that he's going to what? Prosper. That means he's going to grow in influence. Even though he attacks the truth of God, he's going to grow in influence. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And then the answer is given by the angel, under 2,300 days, then will the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, that's the background to the year 1844, biblically. You see, the devil has always worked by counterfeiting the truth. And you understand what a counterfeit is. A counterfeit is something that looks like the real thing, but in actual fact is a counterfeit. And a counterfeit looks like the genuine. For example, if I offered you a $100 bill this morning and I said, look, you just give me $20 change and you can keep the rest. Now, most of us would think that that was a pretty good bargain. But if I told you that the note that I was offering, and you saw the colour of the note, it was red, would you be tempted to think that you're going to get $80? No, because we know that $100 notes are not red, they're green. So the devil doesn't work like that. He offers a $100 note that's green and feels and looks like the real genuine thing. And unless you and I know a lot about notes, we'd all be pretty well deceived. And that's the way the devil works. And this morning I'm going to talk to you about 1844, because I'm not going to study it from the biblical point of view. That's a different study. I want to deal with what actually happened in 1844 as far as the world is concerned, and why it is such a significant date. You see, there was a tremendous revival around the world in the years up until 1844. People from every church, Methodists, Anglicans, Lutherans, Catholics, Baptists, they all became convinced that Jesus was coming. Not everybody, but many of those churches did. And they were the ones who were teaching that Jesus was going to come on October 22, 1844. I want to remind us all that there was no Seventh-day Adventist in existence on October 22, 1844. Seventh-day Adventists have never, ever set a date for the coming of Jesus. Ever. The folk who set the date for the coming of Jesus were the Methodists and the Anglicans and the Presbyterians and Catholics. They were all lovely, good, wonderful people. Wonderful people. But they were the ones who set the date for the coming of Jesus. And as a result, when Jesus didn't come back on October 22, 1844, you can appreciate that there was a tremendous disappointment. You imagine as a farmer, some of the farmers here, you sold up everything. You put all the money into what you believed was the coming of Jesus, and preaching and teaching it and printing pamphlets and everything that was associated with the coming of Jesus, and he didn't come then on October 22, when you had sold up everything and your hopes were so much glued to the coming of Jesus. Can you imagine how devastated those poor people were? It's hard for us to appreciate the devastation that took place in those people's hearts. And of course, as a result of that, the inevitable happened. There were many who gave up their faith in the Bible. And they said the whole thing's a lot of nonsense. And they gave it away. And then some actually turned around and began to ridicule and persecute those who were believing still in the coming of Jesus. But there were some who said, look, the Bible's not wrong. It must be our misunderstanding. And so they began to study again. And 4 years later, in 1848, they met together in what today is known as the Sabbath Conference. And this Sabbath Conference was made up of these Anglicans and Presbyterians and Catholics and Baptists. And they came together to study the prophecies of Daniel, and in particular the story of the coming of Jesus. And as a result of the Sabbath conference, they worked out a theology. Over those 4 years, they worked out a theology as they studied together, which was the basis of their understanding of Daniel chapter 8 and verse 14. Now you'll remember that Daniel 8, we read in verse 12 that what was going to happen, that the truth of God was going to be trodden down for 2,300 years. Now, if you're treading something down, what does that suggest is happening? If I'm treading something down, do I regard it highly or no regard at all? No regard. And for 2,300 years, prophetic days or years, the truth of God had been trodden underfoot. That means it had been neglected. It had been rejected. It had become blinded. We were talking in Sabbath school this morning about the 400 years that the children of Israel were in Egyptian slavery, and how that long period of 400 years just about wiped out all understanding about God. So you can imagine over a period of 2,300 years now, the truth of God was just about forgotten. And so they worked out a theology in the Sabbath conference in 1848 as to what the Bible taught. And as a result of their study over those 4 years, they worked out 5 great teachings that they believed in. The first great teaching was the sanctuary. The whole plan of salvation, They now understood, because many of them had been brought up to understand what the Reformation had taught, and they believed that. But as they began to study the sanctuary, and this is why the sanctuary is so important, it helped them to understand a broader understanding about the plan of salvation that they had never understood before, because most of the emphasis of the Reformation was on what we call today justification by faith. And that's fine, that's wonderful, that's the foundation of everything. But there's more to the story of salvation than only justification, as we noticed the last time I was up here, because the Bible teaches not only what Christ has done for us, but what Christ wants to do in us. And so the sanctuary helped them to understand that. And they began to learn about the heavenly sanctuary that they hadn't understood before. And the second great truth that came out of the Sabbath conference was the second advent, the second coming of Jesus. They became very clear as to what the Bible taught about the second coming of Jesus. The third great truth that came out of the Sabbath conferences was the Sabbath itself. The Sabbath wasn't new because it had been taught all through the Bible, but it had been lost sight of in the majority of cases. And so the Sabbath was rediscovered. And then thirdly, the state of the dead. This was a truth that had been lost sight of too. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, they had been taught that you go to heaven when you die, which still many believe today. But the Sabbath conferences, as they studied this subject very clearly, they began to understand about soul sleep and the fact that we sleep until Jesus comes back. That came out of the Sabbath conference. And then the fifth great teaching was the spirit of prophecy. And it's these 5 pillars that were worked out by these good, sincere Christians of different denominations. As they studied the Bible over those 4 years, these are the 5 pillars that came out of that Sabbath conference. And by the way, you can sense by looking at that those 5 pillars are the pillars of Seventh-day Adventism. That's where Seventh-day Adventism was born, out of those Sabbath conferences that took place over those 4-year period. Now, you know, I find today that there are some who want to downplay some of these pillars. Some of us are somewhat embarrassed sometimes when we talk about the spirit of prophecy. And I've met some of our youth who don't understand many of these things. But I tell you, when you as youth understand these things, the youth suddenly take on a different attitude. And I've seen in our AYCs and meetings that we hold with our youth, how when they understand what this church is about, they become new people. And of course, that's the devil's plan, is to downgrade these great pillars. That's what he's been trying to do, and that's what he is doing right now, is watering down the distinctivenesses of our message. You see, truth never ever is understood without conflict. Down through the years, whenever truth has been brought to the fore, you take the Reformation. When the Luther and all of these great reformers stood up, they were bitterly persecuted. The Baptists, in teaching baptism by immersion, were immensely persecuted. When I was over in Scotland, I saw there where they tied up these Christians who believed in baptism. They would tie them up to a post out, because up in Scotland the tides are very long. And they would go out and they would tie them to these posts. And of course, as the tide came in, gradually the water would come up and up and up and up. And many of them drowned as a result of the persecution. And I stood there and I looked on that very beach where countless numbers died. I have no idea how many people died. God knows, and he knows every one of them. And I believe they'll have a special place in God's kingdom. Faithful unto death. Even though they didn't understand all that we understand, but what they did understood, they believed with all their hearts. Yes, well, it's a wonderful thing. It's inspirational to read about these men and women who were so faithful in the past to God. And the devil began to be concerned about folk becoming involved with these 5 great pillars. And so he called his evil angels together and they began to strategize as to how they would oppose these 5 pillars. And the first thing they came up with was an opposing theology. But they realized that, the devil realized and his angels realized that that really wasn't going to cut it all. Because those who loved the Lord and were sincere and studied the Bible soon could tell the difference between the false theology and the genuine theology. And so that didn't cut it. So he came up with some other strategies. And the other strategy that he came up with is that he would pervert truth. You see, the devil realizes that not all of us think exactly the same. And what appeals to you may not necessarily appeal to me. So that's why the devil came up with a number of different strategies, hoping to appeal to the vast, vast majority of people. Because if they're not interested in this, then he would get them interested in that. And the devil doesn't worry what you believe as long as you don't believe the truth. And so as time went on, he then began to pervert truth. And he had people who began to change the truth. Now, that was very successful, particularly with Christians. But he realized that still wasn't enough, because those who searched the scriptures soon were able to see the difference between the perversion and the truth. Then he had a third strategy, and this was a very, very successful one. He brought a spirit of lukewarmness into those who claimed that they believed these messages. You know, they believed it, yes, intellectually, yes, I believe it, but they were lukewarm about it. And their initiative to spread the gospel was talk and no action. And I want to have a look at these strategies this morning, because we can notice what's happening today as a result of some of these strategies. Now, what was the significant year that we're talking about? 1844. In the year 1844, August of 1844, 2 men met in a cafe in Paris. The first man's name was Karl Marx. Ever heard of him? And the second man's name was George Engels. And on the 19th of November 1844, Engels wrote to Marx this letter. Listen, I'm going to quote it. "We are at present holding public meetings all over the place to set up societies for the advancement of the workers. By a large majority, everything Christian was banned from the rules." Then he went on to say, "The criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism, and we are working for the abolition of religion and for real happiness." So that would suggest to me that if you're a Marxist and you live in a Marxist country like North Korea and Russia and China, that you would, when you visited those countries, you would find that everyone was smiling and happy and they just loved to live there. We all know that that's not true. Most would leave those countries today if they were allowed to. They'd walk out of it. And so, but Marx was saying, and Engels was saying, that this communism will bring happiness. And that devil's counter-strategy, is it dead today? Even in Australia. Is that dead today? Certainly not. We've got the same hammer and sickle in the union movement. Many of our unions mouth the same platitudes that Marx and Engels came up with. Even today, here in Australia. And that appeals to some people. The idea of communism appeals to some people when they're told, doesn't matter what you believe, you can get to the top of the pile. But that's only a group. You can understand that didn't appeal to everybody, and so the devil had to come up with more strategies, and he did. He wanted now to appeal to the intellectuals. And in the year 1844, Charles Darwin writes the first sketch of his Origin of Species. In the very year that God's message, the three angels' messages were raised up, in that very year which says to worship God as the creator, the devil brought in Charles Darwin to teach that we evolved over millions of years. The very year, just before October 22, 1844. And I must say that I find it very, very difficult to understand how anyone with any intellectual ability at all can believe that we all came from nothing. It stretches my mind beyond that I can understand or believe. In fact, the Hawkins and the Dawkins of this world, you know, who sat in the chairs of Oxford University and Cambridge University in England until, of course, Hawkins' death, they formed a society called the Brights. And the Brights believed that we came from nothing, as evolution and so forth teaches. And the implication is, unless you believe this, you were not bright. That's why they call themselves the Brights. Talk about intellectual snobbery of the highest order. And that appeals to some people. Once again, Darwinism doesn't appeal to everybody either. But can you see what's happening? The devil's throwing out all these false teachings, appealing to this one and that one and that one. And the devil doesn't mind whether you're a communist or whether you're an atheist or whether you're an evolutionist. The devil doesn't worry that, as long as you don't follow the truth. But he had more up his sleeve yet, because once again, those isms that we've been talking about still don't appeal to everyone. Now he wanted to get after the Christians. And he worked upon a person's name, and what's the year we're talking about? 1844, by the name of John Nelson Darby. Now, Darby brought in the idea of dispensationalism. Now, you may not have heard about that, but let me tell you, you've heard about the influence of it. Wouldn't be one person here that doesn't know about dispensationalism, although you may not know it by that name. John Darby taught that the world's history was divided into 7 distinct parts, and the people who lived in the different periods were saved differently. For example, in the Old Testament, you were saved by keeping the law. In the New Testament, you're saved by grace with no law. This is part of dispensationalism. And he taught very clearly that God works differently in different stages. And he says that in the period of grace, God is interested only in the church. And with the church will eventually be raptured away before the Lord's return. They'll be raptured into what is called the secret rapture. Ever heard about that? This is all part of dispensationalism. And then, when the church has been raptured away, then God's going to work upon the Jews. And by the way, much of what's going on today in Israel is all to do with this false theology. Mr. Trump is absolutely saturated in it because that's where his voting base comes from the evangelicals who all believe this, and the Jews have got to go back to Jerusalem and the temple's going to be rebuilt. That's why America is absolutely committed to Israel. And you haven't heard one word from Trump about the poor people in Gaza, because they've got to be eliminated. He doesn't quite say it that way, but that's why very little is said, because he is under the influence hugely of evangelical Christianity. And this is from the year 1844, dispensationalism. And as a result of dispensationalism, we live in this world in which just about every evangelical Christian, your Pentecostal friends and your Baptist friends and those in the Christian world that we might call evangelicals, and they're good people, but they have been so saturated in this teaching that that's what they believe. And so when you talk to them about the second coming of Jesus, they have a very, very different concept about the second coming of Jesus than what you and I have. And we need to understand that when we talk to them. Now, that teaching, by the way, did not originate with J.N. Darby. It actually comes from the Jesuits. And there was a Jesuit priest by the name of Manuel Lacunza who lived from 1731 to 1801. He lived in Chile. He was a Spanish of Chilean and spoke Spanish. And he wrote a book that you can see on the screen now called The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty. And then one day, an enterprising preacher in London by the name of Edward Irving actually translated his Spanish into English. And so it began to spread now in the English-speaking world. And Edward Irving's church is where modern speaking in tongues began, which is very, very interesting. And J.N. Darby took the doctrine that the Jesuit invented and modernized it. And of course, the reason the Jesuits invented this is to counter what the reformers were teaching in the Reformation, what is termed in history the counter-Reformation. You know, to undermine the teachings of the Reformation. And the whole secret rapture was invented to undermine what Luther and Knox and Wesley and all of these men believed. Now, these evangelicals who claim to be following these men don't understand that their forefathers would turn in their graves if they knew they were teaching this. This comes to us from the Catholic Church, not from Protestantism and the Bible at all. So, as time went on, This had a tremendous influence in the Christian world. Then in 1844, the rappings began in New York. And a few years after this, you've heard of the Fox sisters. And modern spiritualism was born. And, I meet some people, and dare I say even some Adventists, and I hate to say this. I have met some Seventh-day Adventists who have told me that 1844 is a non-event. Nothing happened then. And of course, they're opposed to our understanding of the sanctuary truth. That goes without saying. My answer to them is simply this. If you think that you're not concerned about it, there are two people in the universe that I know are very concerned about it. One is God himself. The second person is the devil himself. Because why has the devil brought in 1844, in that very year that God's message, his three angels' messages, began to be preached, why is it that in that very year all the modern isms and offshoots and so forth all began in the same year? Because the devil was trying to divert people's attention from the truth of God. And all of this all began around 1844. Then in the early 1800s, there was a man born by the name of Joseph Smith. Now he taught, and his followers still believe it, that we are all divine. And we follow the priesthood of Melchizedek. Then on June 27, 1844, he was assassinated. Joseph Smith was shot. But the church, the Mormon church today, which is based on what Joseph Smith said, is another diversion. They have some things that are right, but they have an awful lot of things that are wrong. But it's a diversion. As I said, the devil is not concerned how people get diverted from the truth as long as they don't follow the truth, because there are some teachings in Mormonism that are very close to Adventism. You might not know that they believe in the first angel's message. They have a health reform message which is watered down from what we understand, but nevertheless they do have an emphasis on health. Then you have the spiritualistic society called Delta Kappa Epsilon. That was, it arose with 56 chapters, particularly in North America and Canada, and this was in the universities, Yale University and so forth. And then there was the Baha'i faith. If you know anything about the Baha'i faith, 1844 is their year. That's the significant year for the Baha'is. Because the Bab, as they called him, believed that Moses was a prophet, and that the different religions have all played a part, and that he was the last of the prophets in these modern days. And of course, he is an offshoot of the Shiite movement in Iran. That's where it began. And in Iran today, the Baha'i movement is absolutely forbidden. So that all happened in 1844. In 1844, that's when the feminist movement began. The ecumenical movement began. All these movements began in and around 1844. And Satan was bringing these counterfeits to take people, to divert people. Doesn't matter what diversion it is, he's not worried about that, as long as they're diverted from understanding the truth. And that all happened around 1844. Now, let's go back to the year 1844, and we find a Seventh-day Baptist lady by the name of Rachel Oakes. There she is on the screen. Now, she met a Millerite preacher by the name of William Frederick Wheeler. And she challenged him to keep all the commandments because Wheeler was a Sunday keeper. And so she challenged him. She said, "You believe in the commandments?" And he said, "I certainly do." Well, she said, "What about the fourth commandment?" And that caused him to go back and to study it. And he studied very earnestly, and finally he became convinced that the Sabbath was right. And that was the year 1844. So the Sabbath was re-established in 1844. Then in 1844, a man by the name of Charles Fitch, as he studied the Bible, began to understand about man's nature in death, soul sleep. Again, that was restored in 1844. Then in 1844, the spirit of prophecy was restored with the first visions given to Alan Harmon. Now, sometimes people say to me, "Well, Geoff, do you think that we might get another gift of prophecy person before Jesus comes back?" I'll tell you what I say to them. If we follow the type, you see, the Adventist church is a mirror image of the Exodus movement because the Bible says it is to be. God's last church, it says, is based on the Exodus movement. It says that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. You've got to only read the first 11 or 12, 13 verses of 1 Corinthians 10, and you'll find that God points out very clearly how that was a type. You know what we mean by a type, don't we? An illustration of God's movement in the last days just before Jesus returns. It says that. And it's interesting, when you study the Exodus movement, the movement, by the way, that we're studying in the Sabbath school lesson at the moment, and if you're not studying that, you're missing out on a tremendous study. And it's showing how that every teaching that we have today comes to us from the Exodus movement. You can't name me a single truth, and I can't show you that it was in the Exodus movement. Whether health reform, did Moses teach health reform? Absolutely. Did he teach reform in dress? Did he teach that? Absolutely. That's not some newfangled idea that Adventists have worked out in the last days just to tell everyone to be different to everyone else. That's not true. It actually comes to us from the Bible. And our message of dress reform comes to us soaked in the Bible, and it comes to us from the Exodus movement. The sanctuary comes to us from the Exodus movement. The Sabbath comes to us from the Exodus movement. Tithing comes to us from the Exodus movement. Prophecy comes to us from the Exodus movement. You can't name a single teaching, but I won't show you the roots are in the Exodus movement. The idea that Mrs. White made these things up or something is just so far from the truth. Got nothing to do with her making it up. It's all based very sincerely and very plainly in a "thus saith the Lord." That's why we can be absolutely rock solid certain that God's message today is not some newfangled idea that someone has concocted. It's based on the sure word of prophecy. And the sanctuary that many of us are very light on in understanding was restored in 1844. It's vital that we understand that. It's the biggest subject in the Bible, whole books in the Bible about it. And yet few of us really have come to grips with understanding it. And I want to encourage us all to really study that. You see, the devil has counterfeited every single truth. Now, as these Seventh-day Adventists now, they were becoming, as what we understand, as they became convinced of the truth, do you know that what God laid on their hearts? The desire now to spread the message to every nation, kindred, tongue and people, to be evangelists and to take it to everyone. And at this very time, in the year 1844, a discovery was made that was going to aid and begin the modern movement of communication. And the man's name was Samuel Morse. Ever heard of Samuel Morse? What did he invent? Morse code. In the very year 1844, God allowed Samuel Morse over there in Washington with a little machine to type out a message to his friend Albert Weil at Baltimore. Quite a few, not that many miles away or kilometres away from where he was in Washington. And he typed out a message. And Weil got the message in Baltimore and he typed it back to Mort. And what was the message? What hath God wrought? The very year. And that was the beginning of the breakthrough in communication, so that the message that God had raised up in 1844 could be taken to every nation, kindred, tongue and people. And I want to tell you something today. No church is communicating more with the media than Seventh-day Adventists. In fact, if you fiddle around with social media, look at TikTok, and I'm not advocating that you do, but if you do, you will know that Seventh-day Adventists are everywhere in social media. I see our African friends singing on TikTok. I see they had the General Conference President preaching on TikTok. And no matter what social media there is today, Adventists are there, and it's so stirring the Christian world up. That's why they are attacking Adventists everywhere now, because of the message that's going out. And people are becoming aware of Seventh-day Adventists. Many years we've felt that we've been too quiet, and we have been. But now suddenly it's being raised up because God has a message. If we believe that we're living in the last days, as I'm sure we do believe, then something big has got to happen. And we're beginning to see it. And obviously, as the devil sees that the church is getting interested in starting to share the message, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think the devil's going to do when he sees that the church is starting to get off its backside and beginning to start to do some things? What do you think is going to happen? He's going to let all his guns blazing. And that's why if you look at the internet at the moment, you'll see so much misinformation about Ellen White. Sometime, perhaps when I come back, I'd like to talk to you about the accusations that are being made about her plagiarism and so forth. Absolute nonsense. But it's being spread and people believe it because they've read it. But it's a lie. And let me share with you some of the things that have happened in the decade of the 1840s. This is when railroads were invented. You know, the idea of trains like we understand them today. It was born in the 1840s. This is when ocean-going steamships came into being. You see, we live in such a world we've perhaps never thought about when all this started, but it all started around the very time that God had a message that was to go to the world. This is when the electric telegraph with Morse was invented. This was when the penny post was invented. You see, up until the 1840s, no one could afford, except if you were very, very rich, to have a letter taken from one part of the country to another. You just imagine back in those days where there wasn't the communication that we have today, to carry a letter from, say, London up to Edinburgh in Scotland would cost a fortune because it had to be taken by hand on the back of a horse. So very, very, very few people could ever afford to post a letter. But in the 1840s, penny post was invented. Now, penny post, like its name suggests, every letter only cost 1 penny. And this revolutionised the postal system like we understand today. And of course, the postal system is now in big trouble over the means that it's changed since the physical letters that some of us are used to sending. You know, my mother used to send out letters because that's what she had been brought up to do as a young person growing up in life. You would send letters to people. She never came to grasp the internet. But the internet has just about destroyed letters, isn't that right? Who posts letters today? Very, very, very few of us. Very few of us. But going back to the 1840s, this is when the idea of the postal service was invented. This is when sanitation came into being. I don't know whether you're easily upset in your stomach, but let me just tell you how life was just before the 1844. This is in Britain, in Europe, we're talking about. When I was over in Scotland, I went down. You know where they have, what is it, every year they have the tattoo. Well, just below where they have the tattoo, they have a museum in what they call the Holy Mile, or the Royal Mile, which connects two of the important castles. And where they have the tattoo is one of the castles. Just down from that, there is a museum, and I wanted to go down to have a look at it. And I walked down, and there, as I walked in, I noticed on the floor there was a pig. Now, not a live pig, a model of a pig, and I'll tell you why the pig was there in just a moment. Pig. And I walked in, and there they have reconstructed life as it was lived in the early 1840s. Right in the middle of the room was the potty. Now, they had no septic tanks. They didn't have anything that you and I experience with our toilets today. They had, the potty was the centrepiece because that's what everybody used, obviously. And the houses usually only had one room. Everything in life went on in that one room. If you can imagine, everything you do take place one room. And the potty was in the centre. At midnight, that potty was taken and emptied out the front window onto the street below. That's why no one ever walked the streets at midnight. And that was the reason for the pig. The pig would then go out and help to clean it up. And if it hadn't been for the pig, those people would have died out. Believe me, the pig was doing a wonderful job. And that happened at midnight. And I noticed that as I walked in, they had a pair of shoes that the people wore back in those days. They were shoes, the top of them was something like our shoes today, but underneath they had risers, and the rise was something like that high, so that you could walk down the streets the following day and be above all the mess that would be on the footpath. It was only in the 1840s that was changed, in the very year that God's message had to go to every nation, kindred, tongue and people. And I'm not talking about the third world now. I'm talking about England and Europe and America. We didn't have any understanding of sanitation like we have today. This is when photography using negatives were discovered. And that's why Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4 says, in the time of the end, knowledge will be increased. And there's nothing like the 1840s. And if you think that I'm just exaggerating and making all this up, then I would suggest that you'd go home, do a little Google search on 1844. And you will begin to see yourself how amazing this year is. It has completely changed the modern world. The discoveries. At the very year when God's message had to go to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, God raised up a people to take that message, and He provided the background, the political background, and the medical, so that the message could be taken. And at the same time, the devil is trying to stir people up to be against this message, because he hates it with a bitter hatred. Listen to this statement that I picked up in by the Spirit of Prophecy. This is what she says. As the Lord's people show their determination to follow the light that has been given, the enemy brings all his powers to bear to discourage them. But they are not to give up because of the difficulties that arise when they try to follow the counsels of the Lord. And you and I can expect, as we face the future, there are going to be more and more and more difficulties. That's why we've got to unite as a people. The idea of us fighting one another over stupid things has surely, those days have long since gone. We've got to unite together, because we've got to press together, as she says. Press together, press together. We need the support of everyone. And in these last days, God is calling upon us to be faithful to Him and to be faithful to His message. And it gives me tremendous confidence when I review and study this, as I began to study it, and I began to think about all that God has allowed us to discover in that year. Suddenly it dawned on me. God's hand is in this. And no wonder 1844 is attacked today. And might I say, within the church sometimes, disgracefully so. Because 1844 is a very, very significant year. Very significant. And if you think I'm exaggerating, you do some study yourself on it. And there's a lot more things that were discovered in 1844 that I've mentioned. There's some of the big ones, but there's a whole lot more. It's deeply significant. The 1840s have changed this world completely. And we don't understand it because we didn't live in the years before 1844. We live way down, and we think the world perhaps has been going on like this for so many years that this is normal. It's not normal. God has allowed these discoveries to take place so that we can be ready for His soon return. And I trust this morning that God will help us to understand the tremendous opportunity that God is giving to us to be faithful to Him and to be faithful to the truth of God. Father in heaven, I just want to thank You for the soon return of Jesus that burns within our hearts. And I pray today that You'll help us to be earnest, that You'll help us to not only believe it in our hearts, but also believe it in our actions. And I pray, Lord, that You'll help us to have a wonderful week this week, that You'll bring us in contact with someone who's wistfully looking to heaven, that You'll give us an opportunity of sharing our faith with them. So, dear Lord, bless us as we leave the sanctuary and as we lunch together now, I pray for Christ's sake. Amen.